So what are the key provisions within a commercial lease? Well, I suppose the fundamental clause is the rent and the starting point. Now, typically the parties have already agreed a rent before we would get involved. But the things to sort of think about, even if the rent is agreed, is whether the rent will change during the course of the lease, or whether there'll be any rent reviews, and if there are, whether that's going to be an open market review or an index-linked review or stepped rent increases. Something else to think about in relation to rent is the payment dates, so whether it's going to be paid monthly or quarterly, as that obviously affects cash flow, and also whether there's any VAT payable on the rent, because again that can have an impact on you as an occupier. Perhaps the next term is the term of the lease, and again usually the parties, that's one of the first things that they will agree, but again things to think about coming off the back of that are whether there'll be any break clauses, either party allowing them to bring the lease to an end early, and whether the lease is going to have protection under the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, which effectively allows the tenant to request a further lease at the end of the contractual term, which will impact on both parties. The third thing, the premises themselves, what is going to be included in the demise to the tenant. And fundamentally there are two different options. One is an internal only demise where the tenant is just responsible for the interior surfaces of the premises, and the other one is a structural demise where effectively the tenant is responsible for everything, the roof, the walls, the structure, foundations. And obviously it has an impact on the potential cost implications to the tenant in terms of their repair liability. Having said that, an associated point, and the fourth point to think about, is service charge. Now, even if the user tenant is only responsible for the internal surfaces of the building, the landlord will then retain the responsibility for the structure and the roof and such things like that, but they will then want to recover the cost of associated costs through the service charge to you as tenant. Now, as a tenant and a landlord, you may want to just consider what the likely running costs are going to be and potentially protect the cost to you, whether that's a fixed service charge or capping the service charge. Next point, permitted use. It sounds like an obvious one, but just make sure that both the use that's referred to in the lease reflects what the tenant actually requires to use the premises for, and the landlord is happy with that. And just a quick side note, the lease can say one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the premises benefit from that use from a planning perspective, so that's a separate check that needs to be carried out. Repair and decoration. Now this is potentially quite an expensive liability to the tenant, and usually a fair position, it will very much depend on the state of repair of the premises at the date the lease is being granted. So if the premises are in not a perfect state of repair, the tenant may want to consider trying to limit their liability to just giving the premises back to the landlord at the end of the term in the same state that they've taken them in, because otherwise if they're taken in a particularly bad state of repair, there are times when the repairing covenant can actually require the tenant to put the premises and hand them back to the landlord in a better state. So the tenant is immediately walking into a liability there. So it's important just to be clear on exactly what the expectations are. Next point, dealing with the lease. So as landlord and tenant, you'll both want to be clear on exactly what the tenant can do in terms of assigning the lease to a third party or granting subleases to third parties. The landlord clearly wants to have a say in this because it will ultimately be their tenant, and the tenant would want to have as much flexibility as possible so that if they did need to leave the premises for any reason, then they can do so without too much difficulty. And then the final point just to think about is alterations and what the tenant can actually do in terms of altering the premises. Again, the landlord will, for obvious reasons, want to retain some element of control over that, but similarly the tenant will want to be able to make the changes it needs to make to operate effectively. Now, typically that's done at the outset of the lease during the fit out, but clearly there may be changes of occupiers or changes of uses which require alterations to be made. So again, just have a thought about what you might need in that respect. So to summarise then, I think the key issues that both parties should be considering when granting or taking a lease are rent and the associated points, term, the extent of the demise, the service charge, repair and decoration, dealing with the lease alienation, and alterations that can be made to the premises.